2 years ago, Sergeant Jonah Michelle Rodriguez was dismissed from her second attempt at basic military training after what her commanding officers called fundamental incompatibility with military discipline. Tonight she would walk into a situation that had already destroyed 3 of the nation's most elite special operations teams, and she would be the only person to walk out alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The security checkpoint at Meridian Federal Correctional Institution buzzed with the kind of electronic hum that never stopped, day or night. Jonah adjusted her corrections officer uniform and checked the roster of new inmates scheduled for processing. The badge clipped to her shirt read J. Rodriguez, Night Shift Supervisor, a title that carried about as much prestige as a participation trophy in a competition. Nobody wanted to win. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her nights keeping people locked up in a place designed to break spirits, when 2 years ago she'd been the one whose spirit had been broken by an institution designed to build soldiers. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh shadows, turning the intake area into a gallery of human failure and second chances that never seemed to come. For most people, working the overnight shift at a federal prison would represent rock bottom, a place where career ambitions came to die, where former somebodies became invisible nobodies, processing the endless stream of people who'd made choices that society couldn't forgive. But Jonah had learned that sometimes the best place to disappear was in plain sight, surrounded by other people that the world had written off. She poured coffee from a thermos that had seen better years, the liquid black enough to dissolve paint and strong enough to keep the dead walking. The coffee was terrible, but it was consistent, and after 18 months of nights like this, consistency had become something she treasured rather than took for granted. Outside the reinforced windows, the lights of Denver spread across the Colorado landscape like a circuit board, each point of illumination representing lives that made sense, people who belonged somewhere, individuals who hadn't been told twice that they fundamentally lacked what it took to serve their country. The contrast between the orderly city lights and the controlled chaos of the prison was a daily reminder of the distance between who she'd wanted to become and who she'd been forced to accept she was. The radio on her desk crackled occasionally, with routine communications from other guards stationed throughout the facility. Officer Marcus Thompson covered the East Wing, a former police detective who treated prison security like an extended investigation into human nature. Officer Sarah Chun handled the medical wing, a registered nurse working corrections to pay off student loans while maintaining her healthcare credentials. Both were competent professionals who did their jobs without complaint and went home to lives that followed logical progressions from their choices and capabilities. Both assumed Jonah was just another corrections officer who'd never aspired to anything more dangerous than breaking up fights between inmates arguing over television channels. They had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in the security office had once attempted to join the ranks of the military's most elite warriors. They couldn't know that her hands, now busy filling out incident reports about contraband cigarettes and suspicious behavior that usually turned out to be nothing, had once tried to master the assembly of complex weapon systems under time pressure. That would have challenged experienced soldiers. The transformation from aspiring warrior to prison guard hadn't happened overnight. After her second dismissal from basic training, Jonah had spent 4 months trying to figure out how to exist in a world where her lifelong dream had been officially declared impossible. The military had given her an honorable discharge, a letter explaining that her services were no longer required, and a bus ticket back to civilian life, with no roadmap for what came next. Her first instinct had been to try again through different branches of service, convinced that the problem was institutional rather than personal. The Army had dismissed her for failure to adapt to military discipline and structure. The Marines had been more direct, citing incompatibility with Corps' values and standards. Each rejection had been professionally delivered and thoroughly documented, leaving no room for appeal or reconsideration. She'd tried civilian contractor work next, reasoning that private military companies might value results over conformity to institutional expectations. But every interview had ended the same way, with polite explanations that their clients required personnel with successful military backgrounds, not documented failures from basic training programs. The contracting world was built on credentials and proven performance, neither of which Jonah could provide. The prison job had come through a staffing agency that specialized in placing people with unconventional backgrounds in positions that traditional candidates avoided. Corrections work paid reasonably well, offered steady employment, and asked few questions about why someone with her educational background and physical capabilities was willing to work nights in a federal facility processing the worst examples of American criminal behavior. The correctional institution community had embraced her with the kind of low-key acceptance that characterized organizations built around managing human failure. To them, she was just Rodriguez, the night supervisor who showed up on time, handled difficult situations without escalating them, and minded her own business about why other people had ended up working in a place most Americans preferred to pretend didn't exist. She'd become part of the background infrastructure of the facility, essential but unremarkable. Inmates occasionally tested her authority during late-night incidents, but something in her bearing discouraged the kind of aggressive challenges that other guards faced regularly. Staff members respected her competence without questioning its source, and administration appreciated that her shifts ran smoothly without generating the paperwork that came from conflicts and confrontations. Jonah had perfected the art of being underestimated. Her uniform was deliberately loose-fitting, hiding the lean conditioning that 6 months of failed military training had carved into her frame. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, kept her makeup minimal, and spoke in the measured tones of someone who preferred listening to talking. When she walked her rounds through the facility, her movement was purposeful but unhurried, efficient but not intimidating. But sometimes, late at night, when the facility was as quiet as a prison ever got, and the weight of her failures pressed down like a physical force, Jonah would allow herself to remember who she'd tried to become. The woman who'd volunteered for every challenging training exercise, who'd pushed herself through physical conditioning that broke other recruits, who'd studied military history and tactics with the dedication of someone preparing for a calling, rather than just a career. The woman who'd been dismissed from basic training, not for lack of physical capability or intellectual understanding, but for what her instructors had called persistent inability to function within established command structures. The recruit who'd consistently questioned orders that seemed tactically unsound, who'd suggested alternative approaches to training scenarios, who'd demonstrated the kind of independent thinking that civilian institutions rewarded but military organizations found threatening. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that had made her unsuitable for basic military service, independent analysis, willingness to challenge authority, refusal to accept suboptimal solutions, had made her exceptionally effective at managing the complex human dynamics of prison security. In corrections work, rigid adherence to protocol often created more problems than it solved, and the ability to think creatively about human behavior was more valuable than the ability to follow orders without question. But late-night reflection was a luxury she couldn't afford often. The prison operated on schedules that didn't allow for extended introspection, and dwelling on past failures was a sure path to the kind of depression that made people ineffective at jobs that required constant vigilance. She'd learned to compartmentalize her disappointments, to focus on the immediate requirements of her current situation rather than the vast gulf between her aspirations and her reality. The intake area where she spent most of her time was a study in controlled chaos. New inmates arrived at all hours, brought in by federal marshals or transferred from other facilities. each one representing a story of choices that had led to consequences society deemed necessary. Processing them required a combination of administrative efficiency and psychological assessment that most people couldn't handle. The ability to see each person as both a human being deserving of basic dignity and a potential threat that required careful management. Jonah had discovered that she possessed an intuitive understanding of human behavior under stress that made her unusually effective at this work. She could recognize which new inmates were genuinely dangerous, which ones were simply scared, and which ones were calculating how to exploit any perceived weakness in the system. This ability to read people had probably contributed to her military failures, since her instructors had interpreted her behavioral assessments as insubordination rather than tactical awareness. The federal facility housed a mixture of white-collar criminals, drug offenders, and individuals whose crimes had crossed state lines in ways that triggered federal jurisdiction. Unlike state prisons that often warehoused violent offenders, Meridian Federal Correctional Institution dealt primarily with people who'd made bad decisions rather than individuals who posed ongoing threats to public safety. The distinction mattered in terms of daily operations, but it didn't change the fundamental reality that she was spending her career managing the consequences of other people's failures rather than pursuing her own success. Her colleagues had slowly grown to respect her competence without understanding its source. Thompson, the former detective, had commented that she possessed an unusual ability to defuse tense situations before they escalated into incidents requiring formal reports. Chun, the nurse, had noted that inmates seemed more cooperative during medical procedures when Jonah was present to provide security. Neither understood that her effectiveness came from skills she'd developed while training for a career that had ultimately rejected her. The night shift suited her temperament in ways that day work never could have. During daylight hours, the facility bustled with administrative activity, educational programs, and the controlled movement of inmates through structured routines designed to simulate normal life within the constraints of incarceration. The energy was constantly shifting, requiring guards to manage multiple simultaneous activities while maintaining security protocols that balanced safety with rehabilitation goals. But nights were different. After lights out, the facility settled into a rhythm that was quieter but more intense, where small incidents could escalate quickly if not handled with the right combination of authority and understanding. Night guards dealt with medical emergencies, psychological crises, and the kind of desperate behavior that emerged when people were alone with their failures and regrets. It required a different skill set, one that emphasized human psychology over crowd control. Jonah had found that her training failures had prepared her for this work in unexpected ways. The same independent thinking that had made her unsuitable for military command structures made her effective at handling situations that didn't fit standard protocols. The same questioning of authority that had frustrated her instructors helped her recognize when established procedures weren't adequate for the specific human problems she encountered. The phone on her desk rang with its harsh electronic tone, interrupting her thoughts about the distance between dreams and reality. Jonah glanced at the caller ID and saw a number she didn't recognize, though something about the area code triggered a memory she couldn't quite place. After 3 rings, she answered in the professional tone that had become second nature. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meridian Federal Correctional Institution, night supervisor speaking. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in almost 2 years, but would recognize anywhere. Colonel Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer who'd signed her final discharge papers and wished her well in civilian life with the kind of professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide personal disappointment. Rodriguez, she said, using her former recruit designation in a tone that carried the weight of authority Jonah remembered from her failed training days. We need to talk. Jonah's hand tightened on the phone receiver as Colonel Morrison's voice transported her instantly back to a world she'd tried to forget. 2 years of careful emotional distance collapsed in the space of a heartbeat, and she found herself sitting straighter in her chair, unconsciously adopting the posture of a recruit receiving communication from a superior officer who'd already decided she wasn't good enough. "Colonel," she replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the storm of questions and emotions Morrison's call had triggered. "It's been a while." "Too long," Morrison said, and there was something in her tone that Jonah recognized from their final interview 2 years ago. The careful control of someone delivering information that would fundamentally change the listener's understanding of their situation. "Rodriguez, I'm calling because we have a problem, and you might be the only person who can help us solve it." Jonah glanced around the quiet prison security office, noting the surreal disconnect between her current surroundings and the conversation she was having. The monitors still showed empty corridors and sleeping inmates. The coffee was still terrible, and the fluorescent lights still hummed with their persistent buzz. But suddenly, the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her former aspirations were beginning to crack. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not in the military anymore. Haven't been for 2 years. I'm sure whatever problem you're dealing with, you have plenty of qualified personnel who can handle it better than someone who couldn't even complete basic training." Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Jonah could hear something in the background. That sounded like urgent radio communications and the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of desperation carefully masked by professional composure. "The Phantom Protocol has been activated, Rodriguez. All 3 teams we've sent in have failed to return. We're looking at a complete operational failure with strategic implications that go beyond anything we've dealt with in the past decade." The words hit Jonah like a physical blow. The Phantom Protocol was theoretical military doctrine she'd studied during her brief time in advanced training seminars, back when her instructors still thought she might overcome her disciplinary issues and become the kind of soldier her test score suggested she could be. It was a contingency plan for situations where conventional special operations had failed catastrophically, where the mission parameters were so extreme that normal tactical approaches were inadequate. "Where?" she asked, the single word carrying more emotional weight than she'd intended. "Northern Alaska, Brooks Range. There's a research facility that's gone dark, and the situation is complicated. 3 separate extraction teams have been deployed over the past 6 weeks. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and a joint task force from Delta and Special Forces. None of them have reported back. Satellite imagery shows no signs of combat, no evidence of what happened to them." Jonah's mind automatically began processing tactical information, falling back into patterns of analysis that 2 years of civilian work hadn't been able to erase. The Brooks Range was some of the most inhospitable territory in North America, hundreds of miles of wilderness where temperatures dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, and where rescue operations were limited by weather conditions that could ground aircraft for weeks at a time. "Extraction attempts?" she asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. "Impossible under current conditions. There's a weather system that's been sitting over the region for 3 weeks, grounding all aircraft and making ground. Insertion through conventional routes impossible. The facility is located in terrain that's inaccessible by vehicle, and the nearest staging area is over 200 miles away, through wilderness that would challenge the most experienced Arctic survival experts." Jonah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver lights while her mind worked through the tactical puzzle Morrison was presenting. She'd studied Arctic operations during her military training, had even participated in cold weather exercises that tested her limits in conditions that most people would consider lethal. But studying something in controlled training environments and actually operating in a place where the landscape itself was trying to kill you were very different propositions. Colonel, even if I wanted to help, I'm not exactly equipped for Arctic military operations. I'm a prison guard who couldn't complete basic training. I don't have clearance, I don't have gear, and I sure as hell don't have the qualifications for whatever kind of mission you're describing. That's where you're wrong, Morrison said, and Jonah could hear the careful calculation in her voice. Do you remember your thesis project on unconventional warfare scenarios? The question hit Jonah like a thunderbolt. During her second attempt at basic training, when her instructors were still trying to find a place for someone with her intellectual capabilities despite her disciplinary issues, she'd been assigned to develop theoretical approaches to missions that fell outside standard operational parameters. Her project had focused on situations where conventional military thinking had failed, where success required the kind of creative problem-solving that institutional training actively discouraged. That was just academic work, ma'am. Theoretical. Scenarios that would probably never happen in the real world. Except now they are happening. Rodriguez, the situation we're facing matches your theoretical parameters almost exactly. Remote location, conventional forces neutralized, environmental. Factors that make standard approaches impossible. You didn't just study these scenarios, you developed the only tactical framework we have for dealing with them. Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter. Her thesis project had been her attempt to understand why creative thinking was discouraged in military training when real-world problems often required exactly that kind of innovative approach. She developed frameworks for operations that required individual initiative rather than unit coordination, situations where following standard protocols would guarantee failure. Ma'am, even if the theoretical framework applies, implementing it would require someone with extensive field experience, specialized training, and capabilities I don't possess. You can't just improvise solutions to problems that have already defeated elite special operations teams. We're not asking you to improvise anything, Morrison said quietly. We're asking you to do what you've always done, think differently. About problems that conventional approaches can't solve. The research facility holds information that's critical to national security. The personnel there include civilians whose disappearance is creating political complications. And the 3 teams we've lost represent some of our most experienced operators. The parallel to her military failures wasn't lost on Jonah. Once again, conventional approaches had been tried and failed. Once again, standard procedures had proven inadequate for the specific challenges of the situation. Once again, someone was suggesting that her unconventional thinking might be exactly what was needed, despite institutional assessment that her independence made her unsuitable for military service. Colonel, there's something we need to address before this conversation goes any further. The military determined twice that I was fundamentally incompatible with service requirements. I was dismissed not for lack of capability, but for inability to function within command structures. Why would you think that my approach would be valuable now? Morrison's sigh was audible through the phone connection. Because right now, Rodriguez, we're not looking for someone who follows orders perfectly. We're looking for someone who can succeed where following orders has already failed 3 times. Personal adherence to protocol doesn't matter when conventional protocol has proven inadequate. Jonah walked back to her desk and sat down, staring at the monitors that showed a world so far removed from Arctic rescue operations that it might as well have been another planet. The irony was overwhelming. For 2 years, she'd convinced herself that her military failures were permanent, that her approach to problem-solving was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of work that mattered. Now she was being told that everything she'd developed, everything she'd learned, might be the key to solving a problem that had defeated the military's best personnel. What's the timeline? She asked, hating herself for asking, but unable to ignore the possibility that American personnel were in danger while she wrestled with personal disappointments. 72 hours, Morrison said. After that, if the research team is alive, The environmental conditions will make survival impossible regardless of other factors. The temperature in that region drops another 20 degrees next week when the Arctic storm system intensifies, and darkness will be total for the next 4 months. Jonah closed her eyes and tried to imagine multiple special operations teams somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, possibly dead, definitely missing, while she sat in a warm office, 2,000 miles away, processing inmates and filling out paperwork about contraband cigarettes. The personal failures still burned, but the oath she'd tried to take 2 years ago didn't have exceptions for hurt feelings or institutional rejection. "I need details," she said finally. "Everything you have. Mission parameters, facility layout, personnel roster, environmental data, equipment manifests, failure analysis from the previous teams. All of it." Morrison's relief was audible. "There's a secure briefing facility at Peterson Air Force Base. Can you be there in 3 hours? Jonah looked around the prison security office one more time, knowing that walking out that door would mean stepping back into a world that had already rejected her twice. But somewhere in the mountains of Alaska, American personnel were running out of time, and conventional military wisdom had already proven inadequate to the challenge. "I'll be there," she said. The Peterson Air Force Base looked exactly like every other military installation Jonah had visited during her brief and unsuccessful military career, all purposeful architecture and efficient design. Wrapped in security fencing and guarded by personnel young enough to be intimidated by her approach, despite her civilian clothes and complete lack of credentials, she parked her 10-year-old Toyota between a row of government vehicles and walked toward the main gate, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her corrections officer uniform and worn sneakers. The contrast between her current appearance and the crisp military bearing of everyone around her was a constant reminder of how far she'd fallen from her original aspirations. The security checkpoint was staffed by an airman who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with the kind of regulation haircut and earnest attention to procedure that marked him as someone still trying to prove he belonged in uniform. His name tag read Martinez, and when Jonah approached with her driver's license and the temporary access code Colonel Morrison had provided, Martinez's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed confusion. "Ma'am, this code shows you're cleared for the intelligence center," Martinez said, studying his computer screen with the concentration of someone who'd never encountered anything like it before. "But I don't show any military identification or current security clearance on file." Jonah had expected this. To anyone checking official databases, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian corrections officer with no current military affiliation and a documented history of training failures. Her clearances had never been activated because she'd never successfully completed basic training. Her personnel file showed dismissals rather than achievements, and her access to classified facilities was non-existent according to every system Martinez could check. "The access was arranged by Colonel Morrison," she said patiently. "There should be a note in the system about special consultation requirements." Martinez scrolled through several screens, his frown deepening with each passing second. "Ma'am, I see the temporary access code, but it doesn't specify what kind of consultation you're providing. For security purposes, I need to understand why a civilian is being granted access to classified briefing facilities." Before Jonah could respond, a voice cut through the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed from their path. "Is there a problem here, Airman?" Jonah turned to see a woman in her 40s approaching the checkpoint, wearing the digital camouflage uniform of an active-duty officer and the kind of confident stride that marked her as someone who'd never had her competence questioned by institutional authority. Her name tag read Foster, and her rank insignia showed her to be a major, probably the base intelligence officer or operations chief. "Ma'am, I have a civilian here with temporary access codes, but no clearance verification or stated purpose." For the visit, Martinez explained, clearly relieved to pass the problem up the chain of command. Major Foster studied Jonah with the calculating look of someone trying to categorize what she was seeing. Middle-aged women in civilian clothes, no. Obvious credentials, requesting access to secure facilities in the middle of the night. To her, Jonah probably looked exactly what she was supposed to look like, a consultant or contractor who'd been called in for some routine support function that didn't warrant detailed explanation. Miss Rodriguez? Foster asked, consulting. The tablet she'd been carrying. That's correct, Jonah replied, noting that Foster had used her civilian title rather than acknowledging any military background. I'm Major Foster, Base Intelligence Officer. I understand you're here to provide consultation regarding a situation in Alaska. Can you tell me what specific expertise you're bringing to this operation? Jonah recognized the challenge in Foster's tone. She was politely asking her to justify her presence, to explain why a civilian had been called in when the military had plenty of its own experts. It was a reasonable question from Foster's perspective, but one that Jonah couldn't answer without revealing information that was likely above Foster's security clearance level. I developed some theoretical frameworks that may be applicable to the current situation, she said carefully. Colonel Morrison felt my input could be valuable for addressing unconventional operational challenges. Foster's expression suggested she found this explanation about as convincing as Jonah had expected. In her experience, theoretical frameworks developed by civilian consultants were usually academic exercises with limited real-world application, the kind of thing that looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations, but fell apart when confronted with actual operational realities. I see. And this theoretical work involved Arctic operations? Among other things, Jonah replied, maintaining the careful neutrality of someone who couldn't say more without compromising operational security. Foster glanced at her watch, clearly weighing her options. She could delay Jonah's access while she made phone calls to verify credentials and purpose, but that would take time and might interfere with whatever urgent situation had prompted the consultation. Alternatively, she could trust that someone at Colonel Morrison's level wouldn't waste resources on useless academic input and allow the process to proceed. Airman Martinez, process her access and escort her to the briefing room, Foster decided. Miss Rodriguez, someone will meet you there to discuss the situation. The briefing facility was located in the basement of the base's intelligence building, behind multiple layers of security that included badge scanners, biometric readers, and a final checkpoint staffed by 2 guards who looked like they could bench press small vehicles. Jonah submitted to each security measure with the patience of someone who understood that every step reinforced her current status as an outsider requiring special handling. The briefing room itself was a windowless space dominated by multiple large screen displays and workstations equipped with secure communication systems. The walls were lined with maps showing various global hotspots, and the air carried the faint electronic hum of sophisticated monitoring equipment. 4 people were already present when Jonah arrived, a young intelligence analyst whose name tag read Chun, a communication specialist identified as Williams, a cold weather operations expert wearing the distinctive insignia of the 10th Mountain Division, and Colonel Morrison herself, appearing via secure video link from what looked like a command center somewhere significantly more urgent than Peterson Air Force Base. The cold weather expert, a weathered-looking master sergeant named Jackson, looked up when Jonah entered and made no effort to hide his skepticism about consulting with someone who appeared to have no relevant credentials or experience. "You're the civilian consultant?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd been hoping for someone who looked more like what he'd expected a tactical expert to resemble. "I am," Jonah replied simply, noting the immediate assessment in Jackson's expression, and deciding that explaining her background could wait until she understood exactly what kind of problem She was being asked to solve. Jackson gestured toward one of the large displays, which showed satellite imagery of the most desolate landscape Jonah had ever seen, endless miles of snow-covered mountains and valleys where no signs of human presence were visible except for a single, small structure that appeared to be completely isolated from anything resembling civilization. "Ma'am, I've been doing Arctic operations for 15 years, including deployments to some of the most hostile cold weather environments on Earth. I've studied this region extensively, and I can tell you that what we're dealing with here is beyond the capabilities of any conventional rescue operation. The terrain is lethal, the weather conditions are impossible, and the isolation makes support operations essentially fictional." Jonah studied the satellite images, noting details that confirmed her earlier assessment of the tactical situation. The research facility was marked with a red icon in a region where the nearest potential landing zone was more than 50 miles away, where the current weather conditions included temperatures that would kill an unprotected human being in minutes, and where the terrain offered no obvious routes for ground-based approach or evacuation. "Master Sergeant Jackson is correct about conventional approaches," Jonah said, moving closer to the display. "Which is why conventional approaches haven't worked. The question isn't whether standard procedures can succeed here. 3 elite teams have already proven they can't. The question is what kind of unconventional approach might work where conventional wisdom has failed." Colonel Morrison's voice came through the secure video connection with the weight of command authority and barely controlled frustration. "Rodriguez, before we go any further, I need everyone in this room to understand exactly why you're here." Colonel Morrison's image on the secure video screen carried the weight of someone about to shatter carefully maintained assumptions. Behind her, Jonah could see the controlled urgency of a command center in crisis mode, with staff officers moving between workstations and multiple conversations happening simultaneously. The digital clock on the wall showed they were now 18 hours into whatever emergency had prompted her unexpected summons. Rodriguez developed the theoretical framework we're calling Operation Ghost Protocol, Morrison said, her words cutting through the skeptical atmosphere in the briefing room like a blade. 2 years ago, during her advanced tactical studies, she identified gaps in our conventional special operations doctrine that we're now discovering were more prophetic than theoretical. Master Sergeant Jackson's expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine confusion. "Ma'am, I was under the impression that Miss Rodriguez was a civilian consultant with an academic background in tactical theory. Are you saying she has actual military training?" Morrison's pause carried the weight of institutional embarrassment. Rodriguez was dismissed from 2 separate basic training programs, not for lack of capability, but for what her instructors characterized as fundamental inability to accept military hierarchy and command structure. The silence that followed was profound. Jonah could feel the reassessment happening around the room as military professionals tried to reconcile their assumptions about her background with the reality Morrison was revealing. To them, she'd appeared to be a civilian academic, brought in to provide theoretical perspective. Now they were learning she was someone the military had actively rejected, twice, for reasons that went to the heart of military effectiveness. Chun, the intelligence analyst, was the first to speak. "Ma'am, if she was dismissed from basic training, how did she develop advanced tactical frameworks?" Those kinds of projects are typically reserved for personnel who've completed initial training and shown exceptional analytical capabilities. "Because her test scores and analytical performance were off the charts," Morrison replied. "Rodriguez scored in the 99th percentile on every evaluation we gave her. Strategic thinking, tactical analysis, problem solving under pressure. Physical conditioning, she exceeded qualification standards for advanced special operations training. The only thing she couldn't do was follow orders without questioning their tactical validity." Williams, the communications specialist, leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to understand a fundamental contradiction. "Colonel, I'm having trouble reconciling exceptional analytical performance with failure to complete basic training. Those seem like mutually exclusive outcomes. Jonah felt the familiar weight of institutional judgment settling on her shoulders as she became the subject of analysis rather than a participant in solving the problem. But she also recognized that understanding her background was necessary for these professionals to accept that someone they'd initially dismissed might be qualified to address challenges that had defeated their best personnel. My instructors felt that my tendency to question tactical decisions indicated disrespect for authority and unwillingness to function within military command structures, she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to defend choices that couldn't be changed. I disagreed with operational approaches that seemed tactically unsound, suggested alternative methods when standard procedures appeared inadequate, and requested explanations for orders that didn't align with stated mission objectives. Jackson whistled softly. That's the kind of behavior that either makes you a great special operations leader or gets you kicked out of the military entirely. In my case, it got me kicked out, Jonah said with a bitter smile. Twice, different branches. Same result. Independent thinking was valued right up until it challenged institutional authority. Morrison's voice cut through the discussion with the authority of someone who'd made difficult decisions about personnel management. The dismissals were my recommendation, based on reports from training officers who felt that Rodriguez's questioning of authority could undermine unit cohesion and discipline. At the time, we believed that military effectiveness required absolute adherence to the chain of command. Chun pulled up a file on her workstation and studied it with the focused attention of an analyst processing new information. Ma'am, I'm looking at the operational summaries from the 3 failed missions. Each team followed standard protocols for Arctic insertion, personnel recovery, and facility assessment. All 3 teams were personnel with extensive cold weather experience and proven track records in similar environments. And all 3 teams failed completely, Morrison said. No communications, no emergency beacons, no evidence of what happened. To them, satellite imagery shows their insertion points, but no indication of where they went or what they encountered. Jonah moved to the tactical display showing the research facility and surrounding terrain. The satellite images revealed a landscape so hostile that it challenged her understanding of how human beings could operate there at all. The facility itself appeared to be a cluster of prefabricated buildings connected by enclosed walkways, surrounded by hundreds of miles of wilderness that looked like the surface of an alien planet. What's the nature of the research being conducted at this facility? She asked, noting details in the imagery that suggested the installation was more complex than a simple research station. Morrison exchanged glances with Foster, who had joined the briefing, before responding. Classified defense research related to extreme environment operations. The personnel there include both civilian scientists and military technical specialists working on projects that have strategic implications for Arctic defense capabilities. The careful phrasing told Jonah that whatever was happening at the facility went beyond routine research and into areas that had national security implications. She'd learned to recognize bureaucratic language that concealed more than it revealed. And Morrison's description suggested they were dealing with something significantly more complex than a missing research team. How many personnel? Williams asked. 12 civilians, 8 military specialists, Morrison replied. The facility was designed to be completely self-sufficient for up to 6 months, with communication systems that should have maintained contact regardless of weather conditions. Jackson studied the tactical display with the concentration of someone whose experience had taught him to recognize impossible situations. Ma'am, even with self-sufficient capabilities, that facility is completely isolated. No roads, no nearby staging areas, no practical evacuation routes. If something went wrong there, the personnel would be completely dependent on outside rescue operations. Which is why we sent 3 separate teams, Morrison said. Navy SEALs with Arctic warfare specialization, Army Rangers with high-altitude training, and a joint task force combining Delta Force and Special Forces personnel. Each team was equipped with the best cold weather gear available and had extensive experience in similar environments. Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the discussion of Arctic conditions. 3 elite teams with proven capabilities and specialized training had disappeared, without trace in an environment where communication should have been possible and where their training should have prepared them for any reasonable challenges. Either something completely unprecedented had happened, or the situation at the facility was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Timeline for the facility going dark? She asked. 7 weeks ago, Chun replied, consulting her intelligence. Files. Last routine communication was a standard weekly status report indicating normal operations and no concerns. Next scheduled communication never came. When we tried to re-establish contact, all systems appeared functional, but no one responded. The implications were staggering. For 7 weeks, 20 American personnel had been missing in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, while 3 separate rescue attempts had also vanished without explanation. Either everyone was dead, which should have left evidence that satellite surveillance could detect, or something was preventing them from communicating despite having functional equipment. Environmental factors? Jonah asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate rather than clarify the situation. Temperature range from -40 to -70 Fahrenheit, Jackson replied. Wind speeds consistently above 50 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 80. Snow accumulation that would make movement extremely difficult even with proper equipment. And complete darkness for the next 4 months due to Arctic winter conditions. Williams added his own technical perspective. Communication equipment at the facility includes satellite uplinks, emergency beacons, and backup systems that should function regardless of weather. Even if primary systems failed, they should have been able to send distress signals or at least indicate their status. Unless something prevented them from accessing communication equipment, Foster said quietly. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room understood the implication that whatever had happened at the facility might have been sudden enough to prevent distress calls, or that external factors were preventing communication despite functional equipment. Morrison's voice carried through the secure connection with the weight of command decisions that had strategic implications. Rodriguez, the theoretical framework you developed, Operation Ghost Protocol, specifically addressed situations where conventional special operations had failed due to environmental factors that exceeded standard operational parameters. Jonah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized why she'd been called in. Her theoretical work hadn't been academic exercise. It had been preparation for exactly this kind of situation, where institutional approaches had proven inadequate and where success would require the kind of unconventional thinking that had gotten her dismissed from military service. The framework was designed for scenarios where traditional unit tactics were impossible, she said slowly. Situations where environmental factors or operational constraints required individual rather than team approaches, where standard equipment and procedures were inadequate, where success depended on improvisation rather than adherence to doctrine. Single operator missions, Jackson said, understanding immediately where the conversation was leading. Correct, Morrison replied. Operations that couldn't be conducted by conventional teams because the environment itself made team coordination impossible. Your theoretical work suggested that certain extreme scenarios could only be addressed by individual operators with specialized capabilities and complete operational independence. Chun looked up from her workstation with information that drove home the urgency of their situation. Ma'am, weather reports show another storm system moving in from the north. If we don't establish contact with the facility within the next 48 hours, conditions will make any kind of operation impossible for at least 3 months. The implications were clear. Whatever was happening at the research facility, whatever had happened to the 3 rescue teams, the window for addressing the situation was closing rapidly. In 48 hours, everyone involved would be trapped by weather conditions that made survival questionable and rescue impossible. Foster leaned forward, her expression showing the kind of concern that comes from understanding tactical realities. "Colonel, are you suggesting that Miss Rodriguez attempt a solo mission into terrain that's already defeated 3 elite teams? Even if her theoretical framework applies to this situation, implementing it would require capabilities and experience that I don't possess," Jonah finished, recognizing the diplomatic way Foster was pointing out that theoretical knowledge and practical capability were very different things. Morrison's response carried the weight of someone who'd made decisions that sent people into situations where survival was questionable. "Rodriguez, 2 years ago, you were dismissed from military service because you couldn't accept that some orders shouldn't be questioned. Tonight, you're being asked to question everything that conventional military wisdom considers impossible." Jonah looked around the room at faces that showed a mixture of skepticism, concern, and desperate hope. These were competent military professionals who understood that they were dealing with a situation beyond their experience, where standard approaches had failed completely and where unconventional solutions might be the only option remaining. But she also understood that what Morrison was suggesting went far beyond theoretical frameworks and academic analysis. Somewhere in the Arctic wilderness, possibly dozens of American personnel were depending on decisions that would be made in this room by people who were running out of conventional options and time. "What kind of insertion are we talking about?" she asked, hating herself for asking, but unable to ignore the possibility that her theoretical work might actually save lives. Morrison's answer came with the finality of someone who'd already calculated the risks and found them unacceptable by any normal standard. High-altitude, low-opening parachutes drop into Arctic conditions that would challenge the most experienced operators. Solo traverses across 50 miles of terrain that has no margin for error. Assessment and possible extraction of personnel from a facility where 3 elite teams have already disappeared without explanation. The briefing room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what was being proposed. In the next few hours, Jonah would either prove that her unconventional thinking could succeed where institutional expertise had failed, or she would become the 4th failure in a situation that was rapidly approaching the point where failure meant writing off dozens of American lives. The woman who'd been rejected by the military for questioning authority was about to be asked to risk everything on the possibility that questioning conventional wisdom might be exactly what the situation required. The secure briefing room had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, leaving only Jonah, Colonel Morrison via video link, Major Foster, and a man who'd appeared without introduction, but whose bearing screamed classified. Operations. He wore civilian clothes that looked like they'd been chosen specifically to avoid attention, and when he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone whose job required delivering uncomfortable truths. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm Director Hayes from a department you don't need to know about," he said, settling into a chair across from her, with movements that suggested extensive combat training despite his unassuming appearance. "What I'm about to tell you changes everything about this operation, and I need you to understand exactly what you'd be walking into." Jonah felt the familiar weight of institutional secrecy settling over the room. In her brief military experience, conversations that began with disclaimers about classified information usually ended with impossible choices and unacceptable risks. But she'd come this far, and somewhere in Alaska, people were running out of time for bureaucratic caution. "I'm listening," she said. Hayes activated a secure tablet and pulled up files that were so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art. What information remained visible painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than she'd been led to believe. The research facility isn't conducting routine defense research, Hayes said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the implications of what he was revealing. It's the testing site for Project Northern Star, a classified program developing technology that could revolutionize Arctic warfare capabilities. The personnel there include some of our most sensitive assets, and the research they're conducting has implications for global strategic balance. Jonah studied the limited information available on Hayes's tablet, noting details that suggested the facility was far more important than a simple research station. And now both the personnel and the research are at risk. It gets worse, Hayes continued. The 3 teams we sent weren't just conducting rescue operations. Each mission included intelligence specialists, tasked with securing or destroying classified materials if the facility had been compromised. The fact that none of them reported back suggests either catastrophic failure or they encountered something that prevented them from completing their missions. Foster finished, her expression showing the kind of concern that comes from understanding intelligence implications. Morrison's voice came through the secure connection with additional information that made the situation even more complex. Rodriguez, there's something else you need to know. 6 hours ago, we detected unusual electronic signatures in the area around the facility. Someone is operating sophisticated communication equipment in a region where no authorized personnel should be present. The information hit Jonah like a physical blow. The mission she'd been considering was no longer a straightforward rescue operation in extreme weather conditions. It was a potential infiltration into hostile territory where unknown forces might be actively operating, where her insertion could be anticipated and prepared for, where every aspect of the operation would be exponentially more dangerous. Electronic signatures suggesting what kind of operation? She asked, though she suspected the answer would eliminate any possibility of conventional approaches. Unknown, Hayes admitted. The signatures are consistent with military-grade communication and surveillance equipment, but we can't determine who's operating them or for what purpose. It could be foreign intelligence services, non-state actors, or something else entirely. Foster leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to process information that challenged fundamental assumptions about the situation. Sir, you saying that whatever happened at the facility might not have been accidental? That we could be dealing with intentional action by hostile forces? We don't know, Morrison replied. But given the strategic value of the research being conducted there, we can't rule out the possibility that the facility was targeted specifically for the technology it houses. Jonah stood up and walked to the tactical display, studying the satellite imagery with new understanding of what the isolated research station might represent. If Project Northern Star was significant enough to warrant this level of secrecy and concern, then the technology being developed there could be valuable enough to justify elaborate operations by foreign intelligence services or terrorist organizations. Timeline for decision? She asked, knowing that every hour of delay increased the danger to personnel who might still be alive somewhere in the Arctic wilderness. 12 hours, Hayes said. After that, weather conditions will make insertion impossible for at least 3 months. If anyone is still alive at the facility, they won't survive that long without outside intervention. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. In 12 hours, the window for action would close completely, leaving American personnel and classified technology in the hands of unknown forces for an entire Arctic winter. Either Jonah attempted a mission that had already defeated 3 elite teams, or everyone involved would be written off as acceptable losses in a situation that had proven too dangerous for conventional military response. There's one more factor you need to consider, Morrison said. her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering the final piece of an impossible puzzle. If you attempt this mission and fail, if you're captured or killed, the intelligence value of someone with your knowledge of Ghost Protocol would be significant to hostile forces. You wouldn't just be risking your own life, you'd be risking the operational security of future unconventional operations. The statement was clearly intended to discourage her from attempting the mission, to make her understand that failure would have consequences beyond her personal survival. But Jonah also understood what Morrison wasn't saying directly, that someone with her theoretical knowledge might be exactly what was needed to succeed where conventional expertise had failed. On the other hand, Hayes added quietly, you're also the only person who understands the theoretical framework for operations that fall outside standard military doctrine. Your work on Ghost Protocol identified vulnerabilities in our conventional approach that we're now seeing exploited in real-world conditions. Jonah turned back to face the room full of people who were waiting for her decision. She could see in their faces the same conflict she was feeling, recognition that what was being proposed was essentially impossible, balanced against the certainty that doing nothing meant abandoning American personnel and critical national security assets. If I do this, she said slowly, there's no pretending I'm just a civilian consultant anymore. Win or lose, my background gets exposed. My theoretical work becomes operational reality, and any chance I had of returning to anonymous civilian life disappears forever. Hayes nodded grimly. That's correct. Whether you succeed or fail, this operation will end your ability to live quietly as a corrections officer in Colorado. Your specialized knowledge will be too valuable to waste on civilian employment. Foster added her own perspective with the straightforward honesty of someone who dealt with classified operations. Miss Rodriguez, even if you wanted to return to civilian life after this, the fact that you attempted a mission of this classification level would make that impossible. You'd be too much of a security risk to be allowed normal civilian employment. The implications were staggering. Attempting the mission would mean giving up not just her current life, but any possibility of the quiet anonymity she'd worked to build after her military failures. Success would mean becoming a valuable government asset who could never again choose her own path. Failure would mean becoming a statistic in operations that officially never happened. But somewhere in the Arctic wilderness, American personnel were depending on decisions that would be made in this room, and conventional military wisdom had already proven inadequate to the challenge. Morrison's voice cut through her internal debate with information that crystallized the urgency of the situation. Rodriguez, 20 minutes ago we lost satellite contact with the facility entirely. Whatever electronic signatures we detected earlier, they're now jamming our surveillance capabilities. We're operating completely blind. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Not only had 3 elite teams disappeared without explanation, but now even satellite observation was being denied by forces that possessed sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The situation had moved far beyond rescue operation into something that resembled a military intelligence crisis. Equipment availability? She asked, recognizing that her theoretical frameworks would be useless without the specialized gear required for Arctic operations. Complete, Foster replied. We've assembled everything specified in your Ghost Protocol documentation, plus additional systems that weren't available when you developed the theoretical framework. Cold weather gear rated for the most extreme conditions, communication equipment that should function despite electronic interference, and navigation systems that don't depend on satellite connectivity. Hayes pulled up another file on his tablet, this one showing technical specifications for equipment that looked like it belonged in science fiction rather than military operations. The technology available now is significantly more advanced than what you had access to during your theoretical work. Some of the limitations you identified in Ghost Protocol have been overcome by equipment developments over the past 2 years. Jonah studied the equipment manifests, noting capabilities that would have been impossible when she'd originally developed her theoretical frameworks. Advanced thermal regulation systems that could maintain body temperature in extreme cold, communication. Devices that could penetrate electronic jamming. Navigation equipment that functioned independently of external signals. Technology that might actually make her theoretical approaches practical in real-world conditions. Training timeline? She asked, though she suspected the answer would eliminate any possibility of preparation that would match the complexity of what she was being asked to attempt. 4 hours of equipment familiarization, Morrison replied. We don't have time for extended preparation or conditioning. Either you can do this with minimal preparation, or it can't be done at all. The conversation was approaching the moment where theoretical possibilities became operational realities, where academic frameworks became life-and-death decisions that would determine whether American personnel lived or died in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Foster stood up and walked to the secure window that looked out over the base, watching aircraft taking off and landing in the pre-dawn darkness. Miss Rodriguez, I need to be honest about our assessment of this mission. What you're being asked to attempt has a probability of success that our analysts calculate at less than 15%. Even with advanced equipment and your theoretical knowledge, the environmental factors and unknown hostile presence make this operation extremely high risk. What's the probability of success for conventional approaches? Jonah asked, though she already knew the answer from the fate of the 3 previous teams. 0, Hayes said bluntly. Conventional approaches have already failed completely. Your theoretical framework represents the only alternative we have, regardless of its probability of success. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the mathematics of desperation. Conventional military wisdom offered no solutions to the current crisis, leaving only untested theoretical approaches developed by someone the military had rejected for the very qualities that might now be essential for success. Morrison's voice came through the secure connection one final time before the decision had to be made. Rodriguez, I need you to understand that this isn't about proving that your dismissal from military service was wrong. This is about whether you're willing to risk everything on the possibility that unconventional thinking might succeed where conventional expertise has failed. Jonah looked around the room at the faces of military professionals who were asking her to attempt something that violated every principle of operational safety and institutional procedure. They were offering her a chance to vindicate her theoretical work and possibly save American lives, but only at the cost of everything she'd built in civilian life, and with odds that made survival questionable. But somewhere in the darkness of the Arctic wilderness, people were depending on someone being willing to make impossible choices when conventional alternatives had been exhausted. When do we start equipment preparation? She asked, knowing that the question committed her to a path that would either prove her theoretical work or end her story in the snow-covered wasteland of northern Alaska. The briefing room erupted in controlled activity as military professionals began implementing plans for an operation that existed at the intersection of theoretical possibility and operational desperation, where success would require everything Jonah had learned about thinking differently when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The woman who'd been dismissed from military service for questioning authority was about to discover whether her willingness to challenge institutional wisdom could succeed. Where following established procedures had failed catastrophically, the equipment testing facility at Peterson Air Force Base resembled a laboratory designed by someone with unlimited resources and a complete disregard for conventional safety protocols. Jonah stood in the center of the room, surrounded by technology that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, while technicians who clearly questioned the wisdom of subjecting a civilian to military qualification protocols prepared systems that could either save her life or fail spectacularly in conditions where failure meant death. "Ma'am, these evaluations are typically conducted over weeks of gradual conditioning," said Chief Master Sergeant Reynolds, the senior technician responsible for the facility's advanced testing protocols. "We're going to be compressing months of specialized training into the next 4 hours, using equipment that most military personnel never see, and testing your capabilities in simulations that replicate the worst-case scenarios you might encounter." Jonah adjusted the sensor array that would monitor every aspect of her physiological response throughout the testing sequence. Noting the concerned expressions of the medical personnel who'd been called in to supervise what everyone assumed would be a demonstration of why civilian consultants shouldn't attempt military operations designed for elite Special Forces personnel, she'd requested the accelerated testing herself, knowing that no amount of theoretical discussion would convince these professionals as effectively as demonstrating that her capabilities matched her academic understanding of what the mission would require. But she also understood that the equipment she'd be testing represented technology that was years ahead of anything available during her military training. Systems that could either compensate for human limitations or fail in ways that would be immediately fatal. "Chief, I understand the risks," Jonah said calmly, checking the advanced environmental suit that would either keep her alive in Arctic conditions or become an expensive coffin if its systems failed. "But 20 American personnel don't have weeks for me to complete standard qualification protocols. They have hours." Major Foster stood behind reinforced observation windows flanked by Hayes Reynolds and a collection of technicians and medical personnel who'd volunteered to witness what they expected to be either an impressive demonstration of unexpected capability or a dramatic illustration of why theoretical knowledge couldn't substitute for years of specialized training. The first test involved acclimatization to extreme cold using environmental chambers that could replicate Arctic conditions down to the molecular level. Jonah entered a chamber that would gradually reduce temperature to simulate the worst-case conditions she might encounter in northern Alaska, while sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked her body's response to cold that would kill most people within minutes. "Beginning environmental simulation," announced the technician monitoring the chamber controls. "Descending to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit with wind simulation at 60 miles per hour. Oxygen content will be reduced to simulate high-altitude conditions, and duration will test sustained performance under extreme stress." Through the chamber's viewing windows, the observers watched Jonah's vital signs display on multiple monitors. As the simulated environment became increasingly hostile, most people began showing signs of hypothermia within minutes at such temperatures, even with advanced protective equipment. The psychological effects of extreme cold were often more debilitating than the physical impact, causing panic and disorientation that led to fatal decision-making. Jonah moved through a series of complex problem-solving exercises and fine motor skill tests as the chamber's conditions reached levels that would challenge the most experienced Arctic warfare specialists. Her core body temperature remained stable, despite environmental conditions that should have triggered emergency shutdown protocols, and her cognitive performance showed no degradation, even as the monitoring equipment recorded ambient conditions that would kill an unprotected human being in less than 5 minutes. "This is impossible," muttered one of the medical technicians, studying readings that challenged everything he thought he knew about human physiological limits. "Her metabolic response to extreme cold is unlike anything we've seen. She's maintaining normal core temperature through what appears to be conscious control of autonomic systems." Foster leaned forward, studying the displays with the fascination of someone witnessing capabilities that fell outside normal human parameters. "How is she generating sufficient internal heat to maintain function at those temperatures?" "Chief." Reynolds checked his equipment readings multiple times before responding, clearly reluctant to believe what his instruments were telling him. Controlled breathing techniques combined with muscle tension protocols that most people couldn't sustain for minutes, let alone the 45 minutes she's been in there. This level of physiological control usually requires years of specialized training under extreme conditions. After an hour at simulated Arctic conditions that would have incapacitated conventional personnel, Jonah was moved to the next phase of testing, equipment integration under stress. The advanced systems she'd be using in Alaska represented the cutting edge of survival technology, but they also required operator expertise that typically took months to develop. She was fitted with the complete Ghost Protocol equipment package, including thermal regulation systems that could maintain livable conditions in environments where conventional gear would fail, communication devices that could penetrate electronic jamming through frequency hopping and signal amplification, and navigation equipment that functioned independently of satellite connectivity through terrain mapping and inertial guidance. The integration test placed Jonah in a virtual reality environment that simulated navigating through Arctic terrain while managing multiple equipment systems under conditions that included electronic warfare, equipment malfunctions, and environmental hazards that could disable or destroy critical systems without warning. Simulation parameters include GPS jamming, communication interference, and randomized equipment failures, explained the technical specialist operating the virtual environment. The scenarios designed to overwhelm experienced special operations personnel with simultaneous challenges that test both technical competence and psychological resilience under extreme stress. Jonah moved through the simulation with fluid competence that suggested familiarity with systems she'd never used before. When GPS navigation failed, she switched seamlessly to terrain association and dead reckoning. When communication systems were jammed, she activated backup protocols and alternative frequency ranges. When thermal regulation systems malfunctioned, she adjusted her movement patterns and metabolic response to compensate for equipment failure. Simulation complete, announced the technician after Jonah had successfully navigated scenarios that typically defeated personnel with years of specialized training. All objectives achieved with optimal performance scores across technical and psychological evaluation categories. The observation room was quiet as the implications of what they'd witnessed settled over military professionals who'd expected to see civilian limitations exposed by testing designed for elite personnel. Instead, they'd watched someone demonstrate capabilities that exceeded qualification standards for the military's most advanced special operations programs. Hayes was the first to break the silence. Chief Reynolds, in your professional assessment, is Miss Rodriguez qualified to attempt the mission profile we've been discussing? Reynolds studied his test results with the expression of someone whose professional experience had just been fundamentally challenged. Sir, in 26 years of conducting these evaluations, I've never seen anyone demonstrate this level of capability across all testing categories without prior specialized training. Most of our elite special operations personnel excel in specific areas but show limitations in others. What we just witnessed represents capabilities that exceed our standard qualification metrics. Foster walked over to the equipment area where Jonah was removing her test gear, her expression showing a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Miss Rodriguez, I need to ask how you developed these capabilities. The physiological control you demonstrated isn't something that can be learned from textbooks or theoretical study. Jonah finished stowing her gear and turned to face the group of military professionals who were now looking at her with the kind of attention usually reserved for phenomena that challenged their understanding of human limitations. But she also knew that succeeding in controlled testing environments and surviving in the actual Arctic wilderness were very different challenges. During my failed attempts at military training, I spent months trying to understand why conventional approaches weren't working for me, she said. I studied everything I could find about human performance under extreme conditions, practiced techniques that weren't part of standard military conditioning, and developed methods that worked with my psychology rather than against it. Reynolds nodded slowly, beginning to understand how someone dismissed from basic training might have developed capabilities that exceeded those of personnel who'd succeeded through conventional programs. You trained yourself using approaches that weren't limited by institutional constraints or traditional methodologies. Correct, Jonah replied. When the military told me I was unsuitable for service, I didn't stop preparing for situations where unconventional capabilities might be necessary. I just did it outside institutional frameworks that might have limited my development. Morrison's voice came through the communication system with information that drove home the urgency of their situation. The weather window is now down to 8 hours. Satellite imagery shows the approaching storm system is intensifying faster than predicted. If we don't begin insertion procedures within the next 6 hours, the opportunity will be lost for 3 months minimum. The final phase of preparation involved mission-specific briefing on the tactical situation Jonah would face in Alaska. Intelligence analysts had compiled everything known about the research facility, the surrounding terrain, and the electronic signatures that suggested hostile presence in the area. The facility consists of 5 main structures connected by enclosed walkways, explained Chun, pointing to architectural diagrams that showed a complex designed for complete self-sufficiency in Arctic conditions. Primary power comes from a small nuclear reactor, with backup generators and solar collection systems. Communication equipment includes satellite uplinks, emergency beacons, and local area networks that should function regardless of external interference. Williams added technical details about the electronic warfare environment Jonah would be entering. The jamming signatures we detected suggest sophisticated equipment capable of disrupting most military communication and navigation systems. However, the gear you'll be carrying uses frequency hopping and signal processing that should maintain functionality even under intensive electronic attack. Hayes provided an intelligence assessment that painted a picture of unknown factors that could not be anticipated or prepared for. We still don't know who's operating equipment in that area, what their objectives are, or what happened to the facility personnel and our 3 rescue teams. You'll be going in essentially blind, with no reliable intelligence about what you might encounter. The briefing concluded with logistical details that emphasized how completely alone Jonah would be once the mission began. No backup, no extraction if things went wrong, no support beyond what she could carry. Success or failure would depend entirely on her ability to adapt theoretical frameworks to real-world conditions that had already proven fatal to better equipped and more experienced personnel. Insertion will be by high-altitude parachute drop from a stealth aircraft, Morrison explained. You'll have approximately 6 hours of approach time to study terrain and finalize your operational plan. Once you're on the ground, radio contact will be impossible due to electronic jamming and terrain interference. Foster concluded the briefing with a reality check that emphasized the magnitude of what Jonah was attempting. Miss Rodriguez, what you're about to attempt represents the most challenging mission profile in our current operational doctrine. The combination of environmental factors, unknown hostile presence, and complete operational isolation makes this assignment extraordinarily high risk even by special operations standards. Jonah looked around the room at the faces of military professionals who understood they were sending someone into a situation where conventional wisdom offered no solutions and where survival would depend on capabilities that couldn't be taught through traditional training. But somewhere in the Arctic darkness, American personnel were depending on someone being willing to attempt what institutional expertise had found impossible. When do we begin insertion procedures? She asked, knowing that the question committed her to walking away from everything she'd built in civilian life and toward something that would either vindicate her unconventional approach to impossible problems or end her story in the frozen wilderness of northern Alaska. The preparation room erupted in controlled activity as technicians, began loading equipment that represented the most advanced survival technology available. While Jonah mentally prepared for a mission that would test everything she'd learned about thinking differently when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The woman, who'd been dismissed from military service for inability to accept institutional limitations, was about to discover whether her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom could succeed where following established procedures had failed catastrophically. The stealth aircraft climbed through layers of atmosphere that grew progressively thinner and more hostile with each 1,000 feet of altitude. Jonah sat in the cargo bay surrounded by equipment that represented the pinnacle of survival technology, while outside the reinforced hull, the temperature dropped toward levels that would flash freeze human tissue in seconds. The aircraft's engines produced virtually no sound, designed to penetrate hostile airspace without detection by radar systems or human observation. She'd made this transition from ground to operational altitude dozens of times during her failed military training, but never with the absolute certainty that she was flying toward something that would either validate everything she'd learned about unconventional problem-solving or end her story in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The contrast between the controlled environment of the aircraft and the lethal wilderness waiting below was a constant reminder of how thin the line was between technological protection and natural forces that recognize no human authority. Her equipment load represented compromises between capability and weight that had been calculated to provide maximum operational flexibility while remaining transportable by a single individual across terrain that would challenge Olympic athletes in perfect conditions. The thermal regulation system could maintain core body temperature in conditions that would kill most people, but only if its power systems continued functioning properly. The communication equipment could penetrate most electronic jamming, but required line-of-sight positioning that might be impossible in mountainous terrain. Most critically, she carried medical supplies specifically chosen for treating trauma in conditions where conventional evacuation was impossible. If she found survivors at the research facility, there was a high probability they would need immediate medical attention that couldn't wait for rescue operations that might never come. The medications could keep someone alive long enough to attempt extraction. The surgical instruments could function in sub-zero temperatures, and the pain management drugs could allow wounded personnel to move across terrain that would challenge healthy individuals. The loadmaster, a veteran technical sergeant who'd probably seen more unusual cargo than most people could imagine, helped her conduct final equipment checks with the professional courtesy of someone who didn't ask questions about passengers who jumped out of perfectly functional aircraft into conditions that made survival questionable. "Ma'am, we'll reach the drop zone in approximately 2 hours," he informed her as she verified that every system was functioning within acceptable parameters. Weather reports show the storm system is intensifying ahead of schedule, but the insertion window is still viable. After you exit this aircraft, you'll be completely beyond any support we can provide. Jonah nodded, understanding that the loadmaster was diplomatically reminding her that once she left the aircraft, no one would be able to help her if equipment failed, if she was injured, or if she encountered situations beyond her individual capability to handle. There would be no radio contact once she reached the ground, no extraction if the mission went wrong, no backup if she discovered that the theoretical frameworks she developed were inadequate for the realities waiting in Alaska. As the aircraft continued its climb toward insertion altitude, Jonah found herself thinking about the personnel she was risking everything to reach. Dr. Michael Harrison, the project director whose expertise in Arctic technology had made Project Northern Star possible. Dr. Lisa Chun, the environmental systems specialist whose work on extreme weather equipment had applications far beyond military use. Captain James Wilson, the security chief responsible for protecting classified research in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. 17 other individuals whose names and specialties she'd memorized during the briefing, each representing expertise that was irreplaceable and knowledge that could not be allowed to fall into hostile hands. Scientists, engineers, and military specialists who'd volunteered for assignment to a facility so remote that their only connection to civilization was through communication systems that had been silent for 7 weeks. The thought that these people might be depending on someone who'd been rejected by the military for institutional incompatibility carried a weight that went beyond personal validation. If her theoretical approaches could succeed where conventional special operations had failed, it would represent more than individual vindication. It would demonstrate that institutional thinking sometimes created limitations that prevented effective responses to unprecedented challenges. The aircraft reached insertion altitude as they crossed into Alaskan airspace, flying at the extreme edge of its operational envelope through air so thin that unprotected human exposure would result in unconsciousness within seconds. Jonah moved to the jump door and began her final equipment verification, ensuring that every system was configured properly and that she carried everything necessary to survive what would follow. Colonel Morrison's voice crackled through her communication headset one final time before she stepped into the void above Alaska. "Rodriguez, you understand that once you're on the ground, we can't help you. No extraction, no resupply, no backup. You'll be completely alone until you either complete the mission or—" "Understood, ma'am," Jonah replied, checking the altimeter. That would guide her descent through 35,000 feet of darkness toward a landing zone she'd never seen in conditions that would challenge the most experienced operators. "For what it's worth," Morrison added, "I think we should have listened to your questions during training instead of dismissing them as insubordination. The military needs people who think differently, especially when conventional thinking proves inadequate." Jonah felt the familiar weight of institutional recognition settling on her shoulders as she prepared to step out of the aircraft and into air that would either support her theoretical approach to impossible missions or demonstrate that some problems couldn't be solved by individual capability regardless of preparation or innovation. The jump light turned green, indicating that she'd reached the optimal release point. Jonah took one final breath of the aircraft's pressurized air, said a brief prayer for the people she was risking everything to reach, and stepped into the darkness above the Arctic wilderness where conventional military wisdom had already failed. 3 times, the descent through 35,000 feet of Alaskan night sky was like falling through the layers of an alien atmosphere toward a planet that existed specifically to kill human beings. The air was so thin at release altitude that her pressure suit was the only thing standing between consciousness and the kind of death that came silently in the vacuum above the world. Her equipment systems worked flawlessly, providing oxygen and thermal regulation that kept her functional during a fall that would have been immediately fatal without technological intervention. At 25,000 feet, she could finally make out terrain features below through night vision equipment that transformed the landscape into a false color representation of one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Mountain peaks that rose like broken teeth from valleys carved by glacial forces that had no concern for human survival. The storm system that had grounded conventional aircraft was fully evident now, with winds that created turbulence patterns visible as distortions in the snow-filled air. Below, through her heads-up display, GPS coordinates for her intended landing zone glowed softly, but Jonah knew that precision was relative when falling through hurricane-force winds in complete darkness toward terrain that offered no margin for error. She'd planned for a landing accuracy that would put her within 2 kilometers of the research facility, close enough to reach her objective, but far enough from potential hostile forces to avoid immediate detection. At 15,000 feet, she deployed her main parachute, feeling the violent shock as the specialized canopy filled with air transformed her controlled fall into something resembling a survivable approach. The parachute was designed for extreme conditions, Its fabric and rigging systems rated for temperatures that would make conventional equipment brittle and unreliable. Even so, she could feel ice forming on the control lines, adding weight and unpredictability to her descent. The landing came harder than optimal, despite her preparation. The frozen ground offered no forgiveness as she hit at an angle that sent her tumbling across terrain, covered with ice formations that could have shattered bones if her impact trajectory had been slightly different. Training took over immediately, her body executing the practiced role that distributed impact forces and protected critical equipment from damage. That would have made the mission impossible before it began, when she finally came to rest against a formation of wind-carved ice. Jonah lay still for a moment, conducting the mental inventory that determined whether she remained operational or had just become another casualty of an environment that had already claimed multiple elite teams. Everything hurt, but nothing appeared to be broken. Her equipment had survived the impact, her communication systems were functional, and her weapon remained secure despite the violent arrival. The GPS showed her position as approximately 1.8 kilometers from the research facility, close enough to her planned landing zone to continue the mission without major adjustments to her operational approach. She gathered her parachute and buried it beneath ice and snow, eliminating evidence of her arrival that could be detected by hostile forces or overhead. Surveillance systems. The temperature gauge on her environmental suit displayed -63 degrees Fahrenheit, cold. Enough to kill an unprotected human being in minutes, but manageable with the advanced thermal regulation system she carried. The wind was gusting to 70 miles per hour, creating conditions that turned the landscape into a weapon designed to strip away body heat and make movement across the terrain a constant battle against forces that could overcome human endurance within hours. Navigation toward the facility required every skill she developed during her unconventional preparation for missions that institutional training had never addressed. The terrain was a maze of ice formations, rocky outcroppings, and snowdrifts that could conceal crevasses capable of swallowing a person without leaving any trace of their disappearance. Each step required conscious evaluation of ground stability, wind direction, and thermal management that would maintain her capability to function in conditions that challenged the limits of human survival. The first indication that she was not alone in the Arctic wilderness came after 90 minutes of movement toward her objective. Her thermal imaging equipment detected heat signatures moving in a coordinated pattern, approximately 800 meters to her south, suggesting organized human activity rather than the random movement patterns of wildlife or natural phenomena. Jonah immediately went to ground, using terrain features to mask her own thermal signature while observing the distant activity through her rifle scope. The figures were definitely human, wearing equipment that appeared military in nature and moving with the disciplined coordination of trained personnel rather than researchers or civilian technical staff. She counted 6 individuals in the distant group, all carrying what appeared to be sophisticated equipment and moving in tactical formation toward the research facility. More concerning, their movement pattern suggested familiarity with the terrain and operational planning that indicated extended presence in the area rather than recent arrival. The observation confirmed her worst assumptions about the situation. At the research facility, unknown forces were actively operating in the area where American personnel had disappeared, and their capabilities appeared to match or exceed those of the elite teams that had vanished without explanation. Whatever had happened to the facility staff and rescue teams, it hadn't been accidental or due to environmental factors alone. After the unknown patrol moved beyond visual range, Jonah adjusted her approach route to avoid their likely path while continuing toward the facility. But the encounter had fundamentally changed her understanding of what she was walking into. This was no longer a rescue operation in extreme weather conditions. It was potential infiltration into territory, controlled by organized forces with unknown capabilities and hostile intent. the research facility became visible as a cluster of dark shapes against the white expanse of the Arctic landscape when she reached a ridgeline that offered an overview of her objective. Through her scope, she could see that the buildings appeared intact, with no obvious signs of damage or conflict that would explain the disappearance of personnel and communication failure that had prompted her mission. But she could also see things that weren't supposed to be there. Additional structures that didn't match the architectural plans she'd studied. Equipment that appeared too sophisticated for routine research operations. And most troubling, clear evidence of recent activity around the facility perimeter, despite the supposed absence of personnel. Somewhere below in the darkness, 20 American personnel might be prisoners, hostages, or worse. 3 elite military teams had vanished attempting to reach this same objective. And she was now close enough to understand that whatever was happening at the research facility was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Woman who'd been dismissed from military service for questioning. Authority was about to discover whether her theoretical frameworks could address situations where conventional military doctrine had not just failed, but had been completely inadequate for understanding the actual nature of the threat. The research facility loomed ahead through the Arctic darkness, like a technological oasis in a landscape designed to kill anything that dared to exist there. But as Jonah approached the perimeter using terrain features to mask her movement, she began to understand why 3 elite teams had vanished without explanation. The facility wasn't abandoned. It was occupied by forces that had turned it into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Through her scope, she could see sophisticated surveillance equipment that hadn't been present in the original facility plans. Motion sensors, thermal imaging arrays, and communication jamming devices that created an electronic perimeter around the buildings. Whoever had taken control of the research station possessed military-grade technology and the expertise to deploy it effectively in conditions that challenged conventional electronic warfare capabilities. The additional structures she'd observed from the ridge were now clearly visible as temporary installations designed for extended operations. Prefabricated shelters that could house significant personnel, equipment storage areas that suggested major logistical operations, and most troubling, what appeared to be detention facilities that could only have one purpose in this remote location. Jonah moved closer using stealth techniques that emphasized patience over speed, recognizing that detection would mean immediate confrontation with forces that had already proven capable of neutralizing elite special operations teams. Her thermal regulation systems kept her invisible to infrared detection, while her movement patterns avoided the sensor arrays that created overlapping fields of observation around the facility perimeter. The breakthrough came when she reached a position that offered direct observation of the main facility buildings. Through the reinforced windows, she could see human figures moving inside the structures, but not with the freedom of researchers conducting routine operations. The movement pattern suggested restraint, supervision, and the kind of controlled behavior that indicated captivity rather than voluntary presence. More critically, she could see figures in military equipment maintaining watch over the captives, confirming that the facility personnel were alive but under hostile control. The realization that a rescue operation was actually possible drove home the urgency of her mission while simultaneously revealing why conventional approaches had failed so catastrophic. Her communication equipment detected multiple radio frequencies being used by the hostile forces, suggesting coordination between different groups and operational complexity that went far beyond opportunistic capture of isolated research personnel. The electronic signatures matched intelligence estimates for foreign special operations units with advanced electronic warfare capabilities. But as Jonah studied the tactical situation, she began to recognize opportunities that her theoretical frameworks had been designed to exploit. The hostile forces had prepared for conventional military response, organized team approaches, coordinated assault operations, and the kind of massive force projection that characterize standard special operations doctrine. They had not prepared for a single operator using unconventional approaches that fell outside institutional military thinking. The detention facility holding American personnel was separated from the main hostile command center by approximately 200 meters of open ground that was covered by overlapping fields of observation and fire. Conventional assault tactics would require suppressing multiple defensive positions while crossing terrain that offered no concealment, exactly the kind of approach that had probably doomed the previous rescue attempts. But Jonah's Ghost Protocol frameworks suggested a different approach entirely. Instead of confronting the hostile defensive positions directly, she could use the environment itself as a weapon. The Arctic conditions that made the location nearly uninhabitable also created opportunities for someone with specialized cold weather capabilities and willingness to accept risks that conventional training would consider suicidal. She began by targeting the facility's power systems, using approaches that her military instructors had criticized as recklessly dangerous but that her theoretical work had identified as potentially effective under specific circumstances. The nuclear reactor that provided primary power was heavily protected, but the backup generators and electrical distribution systems were vulnerable to someone willing to operate in conditions that would kill most people within minutes. Working in temperatures that dropped below -70 degrees Fahrenheit during the facility's artificial night cycle, Jonah systematically disabled backup power systems while avoiding detection by forces that assumed no one could survive extended exposure to such conditions. Her thermal regulation equipment kept her functional while her metabolic conditioning allowed her to maintain fine motor control in temperatures that would have rendered conventional personnel unconscious. The power failures she created weren't dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, but they degraded the hostile forces' electronic surveillance capabilities while creating opportunities for movement that hadn't existed under full power conditions. As heating systems failed in non-critical areas, the occupying forces concentrated in fewer locations to maintain survivable temperatures, reducing their ability to maintain comprehensive security coverage. Her approach to the detention facility used techniques that violated every principle of tactical movement her military instructors had tried to teach her. Instead of avoiding environmental hazards, she used them as concealment. Instead of maintaining equipment in perfect operational condition, she allowed ice accumulation that changed her thermal signature beyond recognition by detection systems. Instead of following established routes, she moved through terrain that conventional wisdom considered impassable. The rescue operation itself required capabilities that existed at the intersection of medical expertise, tactical knowledge, and environmental survival skills that no institutional training program had ever attempted to combine. The American personnel she found had been held for 7 weeks in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, suffering from hypothermia, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that would have broken most people completely. Dr. Harrison was barely conscious when she reached him, his core body temperature dangerously low despite the heated detention area. Dr. Chen had sustained injuries during the initial capture that had been inadequately treated, leaving her with mobility limitations that would complicate any evacuation attempt. Captain Wilson had been subjected to interrogation, techniques that had left him physically and psychologically compromised, but still capable of providing tactical information about the hostile forces. "Who are you?" Wilson whispered when Jonah reached his position, his voice carrying the hoarse quality of someone who'd endured weeks of captivity in conditions that challenged survival. "Jonah Rodriguez," she replied quietly, administering medical treatments that would stabilize his condition enough to attempt movement. "I'm here to get you out." Wilson's expression showed the kind of disbelief that comes from weeks of abandoned hope suddenly confronted with impossible rescue. "You're alone? Where's your team?" "I am the team," Jonah said. helping him to a sitting position while assessing his capability to move across terrain that would challenge healthy personnel. Can you walk? The extraction of 17 survivors across 50 miles of Arctic wilderness while avoiding hostile forces that would be searching for them represented everything that conventional military doctrine considered impossible. Injured personnel, limited supplies, electronic jamming that prevented communication with outside support, and environmental conditions that could kill anyone who stopped moving for extended periods. But it also represented exactly the kind of situation that Jonah's theoretical frameworks had been designed to address. Operations that required individual initiative rather than unit coordination. Missions where standard equipment and procedures were inadequate. Situations where success depended on unconventional approaches that institutional training had never envisioned. She moved the survivors in small groups, using routes that avoided established paths and detection systems, relying on her understanding of Arctic survival to keep them alive in conditions that pushed human endurance beyond normal limits. The medical supplies she carried became critical for treating hypothermia and injuries that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. The hostile forces launched search operations as soon as they discovered the facility had been breached. But their efforts were hampered by the same environmental factors that made conventional rescue impossible. They had technology and training optimized for temperate climate operations, while Jonah was using techniques specifically developed for extreme Arctic conditions. The breakthrough that ensured mission success came when she turned the hostile forces' own electronic warfare capabilities against them. Using equipment modifications that her military instructors had forbidden as too dangerous for field use, she created false signal patterns that suggested multiple rescue teams operating in different areas simultaneously. The deception worked because it matched the hostile forces' expectations of how American rescue operations would be conducted. They deployed to counter multiple conventional approaches that didn't exist, leaving gaps in their coverage that allowed Jonah to move the survivors toward extraction points that would have been impossible to reach under normal security conditions. 48 hours after beginning the rescue operation, Jonah reached the predetermined extraction coordinates with 15 of the 17 survivors. 2 had died during the movement despite her medical interventions, succumbing to injuries and exposure that no individual operator could have prevented. But 15 American personnel, who'd been written off as casualties, were alive and free because someone had been willing to attempt what conventional wisdom considered impossible. The helicopter evacuation took place under weather conditions that pushed aircraft capabilities to their absolute limits, with pilots who later described the operation as the most challenging extraction they'd ever attempted. But as the aircraft lifted off from the Arctic wilderness, carrying survivors who shouldn't have lived through 7 weeks of captivity, Jonah reflected on the cost of proving that unconventional thinking could succeed where institutional approaches had failed. Colonel Morrison was waiting when the evacuation helicopter landed at the forward staging base, her expression showing a mixture of relief, amazement, and institutional embarrassment that would reshape how the military approached unconventional operations. Rodriguez, she said as Jonah helped transfer the last survivor to medical personnel who'd been standing by for casualties they'd never expected to treat. I owe you an apology. We all do. Jonah looked around at the medical team working to save lives that conventional military wisdom had declared beyond rescue, then back at Morrison with the expression of someone who'd finally proven that questioning institutional authority could be exactly what impossible situations required. No apology necessary, ma'am, she replied. You did what you thought was right when you dismissed me from training. I did what I knew was right when I developed approaches that institutional thinking couldn't accommodate. As the survivors were transported to medical facilities where they would recover from their ordeal, Jonah faced the reality that her success had fundamentally changed her relationship with the military establishment that had rejected her. She was no longer a failed recruit or civilian corrections officer. She was someone who'd accomplished what 3 elite teams had found impossible. The debriefing process would reveal that the hostile forces had been foreign intelligence operatives conducting an extended operation to capture American Arctic warfare technology and the personnel who developed it. Their sophisticated capabilities had been specifically designed to counter conventional special operations approaches, making them vulnerable only to unconventional methods that fell outside standard military doctrine. Project Northern Star would be relocated to more secure facilities. The survivors would receive recognition for their endurance under impossible conditions, and the military would begin developing new training programs based on Jonah's theoretical frameworks. But the most important outcome was the recognition that institutional thinking sometimes created limitations that prevented effective responses to unprecedented challenges. 6 months later, Jonah stood in a Pentagon briefing room explaining GHOST protocol methodologies to senior officers who were finally ready to listen to approaches that challenged conventional wisdom. The woman who'd been dismissed from basic training for questioning authority had become the architect of new doctrine that embraced unconventional thinking as essential for addressing problems that traditional approaches couldn't solve. The mission that had broken every elite unit had been completed by someone the military had declared unsuitable for service, proving that sometimes the most valuable soldiers are the ones who refuse to accept that impossible simply means no one has figured out the right approach yet. Her success hadn't vindicated her dismissal from basic training. It had demonstrated that institutional limitations sometimes prevent organizations from recognizing exactly the kind of thinking they need most when conventional solutions prove inadequate to the challenges they face. The research facility in Alaska had been reclaimed. The hostages had been rescued, and the technology had been secured. But more importantly, the military had learned that questioning authority wasn't always insubordination. Sometimes it was exactly the kind of independent thinking that could succeed where following orders had already failed catastrophically. Jonah Rodriguez, the failed recruit who'd become a corrections officer, was now the architect of military doctrine that would reshape how America approached the impossible missions that conventional wisdom couldn't solve. She'd proven that failure to fit institutional expectations didn't mean failure to serve one's country. It just meant finding different ways to make contributions that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.